everyone. I'm Linda Nickell, and welcome to the Happiness Hour. Every week, photographers meet here to connect, inspire, and create. My guests share their images, photography tips, and their stories of inspiration. But tonight's guest is Henrik Nilsson.
Hey, how are you? And I'm coming to you from Wells Gray Provincial Park in British Columbia, which is where I live. It is pretty much the middle of February, and I'm out on one of the trails here in the park looking for wildlife. I just had a pretty good encounter with a moose about half hour ago at one of the waterfalls, and so I've got some decent images and video from that, I think. Forgive me for not looking at the camera too much, but the trail I'm on it's a bit narrow and the snow conditions are not great. So there's a bunch of holes and other stuff. Hang on. I brought with me Canon R5 and Canon 600mm f4 lens, but this video is not going to be about camera gear. This is going to be about photographing wildlife in winter. Winter photography does pose a few different challenges that you don't get in the other seasons. I'll probably make a different video with some tips for wildlife photography in winter. There's for sure a couple of things that can help you to get more keepers. But anyhow, what follows my little talk here is some images and some video of wildlife taken during the winter time. So I hope you like it. And as always, leave a comment, leave your thoughts below. And if you have some suggestions, I'm certainly happy to read those too. So here we go. Hope you like it. See ya.
Henrik is a wildlife photographer based in British Columbia, whose work has been featured by National Geographic, BBC Earth, and Canadian Geographic. His work includes beautiful images of wolves, owls, polar bears, and other cold weather loving wildlife. And with winter just around the corner, Henrik's going to talk about how you can keep yourself and your camera gear prepared in his presentation, Winter Photography Do's and Don'ts. If you're on Instagram, look for him at Photography by Henrik, and his website is photographybyhenrik.com. And please go to his YouTube channel. He's been posting some of his work there. So, Henrik, welcome to the Happiness Hour.
Thank you very much. And yeah, thank you, Linda, for having me on. It's going to be a fun evening, I hope. I spent a bit of time looking at your YouTube channel, and before I know it, I think I watched, I don't know, if I had to guess, probably 10 different episodes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and what I really liked about it is that there is something for virtually everybody. I mean, I watched one on social media, watched the storytelling one, Karen Cooper. I watched her on there as well. And I really enjoy the fact that there's such a breadth of topics in there. So it's, yeah, I find it quite enjoyable. And thanks everybody for joining. Linda said I had to keep this under 6 hours, so I'm going to do my absolute best to do that. I'm just kidding. I think I'm probably going to go for roughly, I don't know, maybe 40, 45 minutes. I like questions along the way. Part of the reason for that is that what I may be speaking about could be something you want to know more about, but by the time you get to the end, you may forget about it. So I like the idea of you asking me as I go along. And quite frankly, it also gives me a little bit of a break from my sequence spiel, if you will. I'm originally from Scandinavia, and somebody jokingly said to me, do you have antifreeze running through your veins because they seem to be okay in cold environments? And the answer is no, absolutely not. I get cold just like anybody else, but I do certain things to stay warm out there, and that's not just for me as a person, but also in terms of what I bring out there. Anything from warm drinks, but it's also additional things like getting your car ready. So we're going to talk about all those things here in a bit. But what I also want to tell you is that this is by no means a right versus wrong. This is what has worked for me. It's not to say that there aren't different ways of doing it, but this is merely how I do it. Good. So I want you to notice, first of all, the very, very original title I have, Winter Wildlife Photography, and then notice what's down below, it's cool. Pun intended on that. So you may say, well, why would you do it? When you get out of bed early in the morning and it's cold, it's easy to sort of say, hey, I'm just going to crawl back in bed and not do it. But that would be a mistake. I mean, cold environments is definitely challenging for many different reasons, but it's also incredibly rewarding. When you think about wildlife photography, it's incredibly challenging and incredibly rewarding at the same time. What I like about it is that as a wildlife photographer, you see things that arguably 99.8% of people won't see, and it's because you put in that time for those results, and it certainly doesn't always happen. I mean, there's lots of times I've come home and I haven't seen any animals per se, but I don't think I've ever come home and not enjoyed my time outside. And I guess you could say, well, what is it that you want to get out of your photographs? And I like to think of it as a visual diary, something you can return to years ago, and you'll often remember how you felt at that moment. And here you have a great gray owl that's coming into land, and I remember that day very, very well. And it's actually a bit of a sad story because This is an area here in British Columbia that I think about 3 or 4 months after I photographed this owl, it was completely wiped out by a forest fire. But it, as a wildlife photographer, it really helps you to connect with nature, and it gives you an opportunity to, dare I say, speak for animals that are facing tons and tons of challenges. And a lot of those challenges are, of course, human created. Anyhow, so in the winter, the sun, the sun is lower in the sky for most of the day vis-a-vis summer. And so it means that you have longer periods of light, or I guess I should say good light. If you're out in the middle of summer and midday, you're going to get pretty contrasty situations. And up here in British Columbia, in the wintertime, it gets light around, I don't know, maybe 8:30 or 9. And then by roughly 4:30, it gets dark again. But in between those two time periods, you actually have almost a full day of shooting. So in the winter, you get a different opportunity set than you do in the summer. So next one, bad weather is actually great weather. And I cannot believe how few photographers are out in bad weather, which to me is good weather. I have a number of friends that I go shooting with here, and I might call them up on a Saturday morning and say, hey, let's go see if we can find some short-eared owls. And they'll say, but it's raining. And so they want to stay at home. Now, as it is, short-eared owls don't really hunt in the rain, but you can still find them along with other types of wildlife. And, when you go out in inclement weather, it allows you to get things that a lot of other people don't have because they simply won't do it. So that would be reason number 2. And so the bottom line with that is, to me, bad weather is actually great weather. And then the third reason is, when you're out and you're hiking around in the snow, there are actually a lot less distractions. I find summer can be challenging as far as finding wildlife sometimes. We're going to talk about this a bit later on. I'm going to give you some tips on how to find wildlife. But I actually like winter because I can see tracks on the ground. And also I find that the shots are often clearer, or cleaner shots, because you don't have foliage, for example, that gets in the way of your shots. So let's talk about being prepared before you head out there. So vehicle, I've been down to Yellowstone, I don't even know how many times, but mostly in the winter. I love winter. And somebody said, well, what's your favorite season? And admittedly, I said, well, not summer. But winter is good for a few reasons. One is there's not a lot of people. I guess I should say there's not a lot of people on a relative basis. You're certainly still going to find other photographers. You're going to find the wolf watchers, but you're not going to find a lot of tourists and RVs. And if you've been to Yellowstone in, well, let's say between May and October, you know how busy it can get down there. And, a bear jam, you may see a bear at 300 meters, and that's if you see it at all. Winter allows you to get up close with a number of species down there. Not so much bears, obviously, but a number of other species allow you to get close. I mean, obviously, don't get too close and follow the park guidelines. So when I go down there, I have chains for my truck and winter tires. I mean, a friend of mine from LA went to Yellowstone a few years ago, and he had to get pulled out of the ditch. I think he said twice. And that was with all season tires. So winter tires, I would say, are almost a must. And if you're driving there, chances are you'll be passing over a couple of the mountain passes on, I think it's on the I-90 that goes east of Seattle. But in the winter, the only part of Yellowstone that's open is the northern part. from Gardner up to Cook City. Anyway, moral of the story is make sure you have winter tires and chains. Jumper cables is another one, not just for you, but also for others, whether it's somebody who's left the headlights on or have other mechanical issues. Jumper cables are a must, but chances are you have that in your car already. Tow rope is another one that I find to be quite important. In Yellowstone, and I'm going to be referencing Yellowstone quite a bit, just because it's where a lot of us will go, and it's quite accessible. So a tow rope is very helpful because in Yellowstone you have to be off the road when you stop. You cannot have any of your tires on the road. You must be off the road. In snow, obviously, it's very slippery and whatnot, and there are some slopes as well. So a tow rope comes in really, really handy for that. I should have actually put, rather than shovel, I should have put shovels, plural. One is a snow shovel for obvious reasons, but the other one is like, one of these, I guess you can call it a spade, but one with a metal, what do you call it, metal blade or what have you. And the reason for that is sometimes you're going to get stuck and snow will be compacted under your vehicle. And a snow shovel is not really going to help you for that, because it's, to keep them light, to make them out of plastic. So you want a heavy duty shovel as well. Flashlight, I think we all know what they can be used for, but you need that. First aid kit, you can buy first aid kits that are, quite good. A lot of people that I talk to actually like making up their own, they customize it. But I would say the bottom line on that part is just have one, whether you make it or whether you buy one. Non-perishable food and water in case you get stuck, and then extra fuel as well. Linda, can I just check in with you and see if there are any questions, or are we good to keep going?
We are good to keep going.
Okay. Okay, so for you and personal items, so, and I can't stress this one enough, layers. Your base layer, of course, make sure it's something comfortable. But here, what you need to remember is that if you're out hiking in deep snow and you start to sweat, chances are that when you get to where you need to be, you're probably going to sit for a prolonged period of time. And in that instance, sweat is a bad thing, because it is, if it can't evaporate, it's going to make you cold. And that brings us into point number 2, and that is, don't wear cotton, because cotton, when it gets wet, does not retain heat. Wool does, synthetics typically do. For wool, I'd really like a good merino wool. So don't wear cotton, don't wear jeans, wear something that is either wool or synthetic. And then a heavy duty coat. I always wear one with heavy, or not with heavy pockets, but with lots of pockets, just for batteries, extra gloves, maybe you have some hand warmers, maybe you have some snacks, and you want all that accessible to you. I would say your boots are, I would say this is probably one of the most important things, is to make sure you've got good heavy duty boots and warm boots. There's nothing worse than being out somewhere and your feet are cold. And sometimes with wildlife, you can't really get up and move around. You're sitting either in a blind or well, I'm going to show you a picture a bit later on when I was in northern Saskatchewan, and I was with a friend of mine, and we basically dug holes in the snow, and we were photographing otters. But we sat there for, I don't know, maybe 4 hours, and the last thing you want is for your feet to be cold. So headgear and a face mask. Headgear, obvious. Face mask is good if it's really, really cold or if it's windy. So I'd say bring both of those. Now your snow pants should be the bib style. So the bib style are the ones that, they come up to about here. And the reason for that is, if you have pants, chances are you're either going to get snow or wind that goes up underneath your jacket and, you know, down your backside. So snow pants, maybe snowmobile pants or something like that, but just make sure it's a bib style so it covers you up high on your body and helps you retain your core body heat. Gloves and mittens. So if it's not too cold, you can probably get away with gloves. If it is really cold, you want to have mittens because gloves won't keep your hand warm as much as a mitten will. Of course, you're in a mitten, you know, your fingers are side by side, so that helps a lot. And bring hand warmers. My experience with hand warmers, though, has been, well, let's just say mixed. I've had lots that, for whatever reason, don't work, and you know, but when they do, they are really, really good. And you can get them for your, you know, for your boots as well. But they don't weigh that much, so I would say bring some of those too. So this one, I'm going to tell you a little story. I am completely 100% convinced that if you do go out there and do this, you need a communication device. I have this little thing called the Zoleo. There's another, I think Garmin makes another one called InReach. But I've learned the hard way that this thing is crucial. 2 years ago, well, let me back up for a second. I'm one of these maybe strange people who likes to look at maps, and we have a valley about, I don't know, maybe 2 hours north of here, and I go up there 8-10 times every year. But I love going there in the winter, and so 2 years ago I found this road on a I guess it's an old logging road map. And so I found this road that was supposed to be there. And so I planned out my day and off I went. And so I found where the road used to be. And so I get all my gear on and start hiking. Well, you know, maybe 300 meters from my car, I step on this rock that had moisture underneath it, and it flips me into a creek. And I'm obviously not the brightest light on the porch, because I got up and I thought I felt okay, and I kept going, and you know, and so I hiked for about 4 hours into the wilderness. And then incidentally turned out to be a dead end. But on the way in there, I'm crossing these old logging road bridges that had holes in them. And of course, there was, I don't know, maybe a foot of snow, sort of the hard, crusty snow. And so I decided, well, I don't want to walk on these old bridges because I don't know if they're going to hold me. And if they don't, I would fall, you know, call it 6-8 feet into these creeks. And when you're out in the middle of nowhere, that's not a bright idea. Anyhow, so the reason why I bring this up is, had I stepped in a hole, or had I, you know, injured myself in some other way where I couldn't move, nobody would have found me there for, well, I dare not even think about it, but nobody would have found me there for a very, very long time. So have one of these if you go out there. And I think the subscription on this thing it's about $25 Canadian, which is, I don't know, $5 US. I'm just kidding. It's probably about $20 US, but it's not a lot. It's, you know, just to have it is I think absolutely essential. And basically the way this thing works is it has to be pointed to the sky. There is, I don't know if you can see it, but there's like an SOS button on here. And so if you're in trouble, you flip the SOS button and it sends off a signal through satellites and alerts search and rescue with GPS coordinates. Anyhow, I won't belabor it much longer, but please, if you're going to do this kind of thing, please have something like this.
And I'm seeing that our friend Karen Cooper, who's also in British Columbia, Vancouver, carries one. So that's great. Can I sneak in 2 questions before you go?
Yeah, fire away, please.
Okay, so let's talk about the boring question. But Jamie wants to know, have you used the electronic hand warmers?
No, but they sound like a great idea, because they probably work more consistently than these other things. No, I haven't. I know I know you can get these things that you just kind of tuck in wherever you want to keep warm, but the answer is no. I haven't tried them yet, but they sound like a good idea.
Okay. I'm gonna sneak one in for Sue. In that example, you were obviously alone when you fell. Sue's curious, do you trek alone or are you working with a buddy system?
That's a good question. So the answer is both.
Okay.
Yeah. The answer is, sorry, I'm hesitating because the answer is for sure both. Sometimes I like to go on my own because you can do what you want to do when you want to do it. But it's not always the smartest thing to do. I guess I would say if you're going to go with a buddy, make sure it's somebody who's like-minded, because there's nothing more annoying than being out there when somebody wants to go left and you want to go right. I don't mean that figuratively, right? But you want to go with somebody who's like-minded. I have a few projects on the go, and just actually last week I met with two other fellow photographers, and I said, here's what I'm thinking, to see if I have common ground with them. And one of the fellows I know really, really well, no qualms about going out there with him. But the other person, I didn't know him quite as well. I mean, he came with dare I say, a good reputation, but sometimes you just got to see for yourself, just to make sure it's a good fit for you. Anyhow, I know that's a long-winded answer to your question, but the answer is I do both. And each has its own merit. But if you're going to do it on your own, sorry to come back to this, but if you're going to do it on your own, have one of these.
That's great. Okay, so I don't want you to flip off the slide before you tell Carolyn, where did you photograph this polar bear?
Oh, so this polar bear is from Churchill, Manitoba. And maybe I shouldn't start on polar bears, but I really have a soft spot for polar bears because of what's going on in the Arctic. The other night, I actually watched a documentary on the polar bears in Svalbard in Norway. And if you haven't seen it, it's on, can I say where it is? What channel? So it's on Disney Plus. And if you haven't seen it, even if you're not a wildlife photographer, but please watch it. I've never seen a wildlife documentary with so many incredible sequences, save maybe BBC Earth. But boy, oh boy, it's an incredible. I think it's about 90 minutes, and then there's another one behind the scenes stuff. But please go watch it. But so this polar bear was up in Churchill. It's photographed with a long lens from a vehicle. So polar bears are, when you see them before the ice forms, they appear to be lethargic, but you can never let your guard down with polar bears. And anyhow, this was photographed from the safety of the vehicle with a beanbag on the door. But he was gorgeous bear.
Can I ask, were you on a workshop or were you doing this on your own?
So I went up on my own I went with a fellow I met years ago up there, and he runs tours, and you need to have I can't remember what they call them, but basically a certified guide, somebody who is certified to be around polar bears, and they all have firearms with them, and they have to know how to use that firearm. If you go on your own, if I remember correctly, you cannot get out of your vehicle. With a guide, you can. And sometimes, not in this particular case, but sometimes you absolutely want to be out of the vehicle just to get that nice low angle shot. If you go on the, they have those big tundra buggies, and they can be good too, but they go rather slow. And when you're on the tundra buggy, you're there with, I don't know how many people they put on those things, but you're there with 20 other people. And so it's probably not going to hit your agenda. For me, it would never work. But But if you go on your own, you cannot apparently be outside on your own. So that's why it's good to have a guide.
Okay, I'm gonna sneak in one more question and I'll let you move on.
Yeah.
Rose is asking, I actually know the answer, but Rose wants to know, what's the bean bag on the door for?
Yeah, that's a good question too. So the bean bag on the door is just for stability. And actually, you know what, we're going to touch on a few things related to that in a little bit. But a beanbag it serves a number of different purposes. One is that you can put your setup. I have a lens here, so you can put your setup rested on the beanbag. So I don't know. I think I have the background blurred, but hopefully you can see it. So you can put your camera here, and then you just rest it on there. Now, I do video and stills. So for video, of course, it's essential that you have a stable platform, but also for your for your still photography, if you're shooting at a slow shutter speed at low light or what have you, you just get that added stability with this beanbag, and it literally is just a beanbag. You get these shaped piece of fabric, and well, you fill it with beans. They're heavy, so I wouldn't, if I was doing a hike, I wouldn't carry it, but certainly if you're in the car, have it on your back seat or front seat or whatever. But yeah, just throw it over you zip down the window in your vehicle and you just put the bean bag, and then you put your setup on top of that.
Okay. Great. Okay, thanks for letting me in.
No, please. So along with the emergency communication device, this is also crucial. Tell somebody where you're going and when you're going to be back. And have a plan for what happens if you're not back when you say you're going to be back. I used to be really not good with that, but I've gotten, I think, much better with it. But it is crucial, and sometimes, well, if you can't get a signal with this thing, this needs a fairly clear sky or view of the sky. So if you're in a canyon, for example, this could be problematic because it's got to communicate with a satellite, or probably more than one satellite, but it's got to be able to communicate with at least one satellite. So if you're incapacitated somewhere, tell somebody where you're going to be. So if you're not back when you're supposed to be, they'll come in and look for you. Okay, let's talk about your camera gear. How do you prepare it for going out there, and what do you do when you are out there? So I'm just gonna move my little screen thing here. Okay, so camera batteries don't like the cold, so put them somewhere warm. I made the mistake once of just putting in a battery in my outside pocket, and it was fully charged when I left, and so I drained the battery in my camera. I flipped it out. I flipped in the other one, and I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was something like 54%. I thought, well, what the heck? This was fully charged earlier today. But the reason is they really don't like the cold. So your batteries need to be close to your body where it's nice and toasty, hopefully. Memory cards, on the other hand, are tough little things. I have a friend of mine. He put his through the washing machine, came back out. Whoops! He dried it, threw it in the card reader. Worked just fine. So those you can usually keep in your outer pockets. You don't have to worry so much about them insofar as keeping them warm. The next three items. So these are things I'm going to go into a little deeper. So the first one is temperature of your lenses into and out of cold environments. Bring something airtight for your camera lens combo. We're going to come back to these. Next one is autofocus when it's snowing. Boy, that can be frustrating. And then, this one here, I don't know how many of you do this, but I shoot probably 80, no, probably high. I'm going to say I'm probably shooting 90% in manual exposure, and I love it. So I'm not talking about auto ISO, which here I think is a little more popular, if you will, but I'm shooting in full manual. And if you haven't done it, maybe it sounds scary, but it really isn't. I'm going to tell you more about that. Okay, so entering into a cold environment. So here where I am, my camera gear actually has its own bedroom, which sounds ridiculous, but it does. it's warm in there. It's usually somewhat organized, fairly organized. But the moral of the story is it's warm. It's inside. And when you take your camera gear out in the cold, there's a few things you need to keep in mind. So coming back to the lens thing, this is one of the shorter lenses I use. Well, I don't know if you can see it, but behind me there's a couple bigger. I have the background blur, so you probably can't see it, but I have a couple bigger. Maybe I'll just grab one. Bigger lenses like this monster here, and it has a lot of elements in it, but it also has, of course, a lot of air. And so when I take that out in the cold, the air inside the lens is warm. The lens itself is warm. And when you take it out in that cold environment, you have warm air and then you have cold air. So that's going to present a problem. I mean, I remember I was photographing moose actually out of a car. And this was back in the day where I just bought my first 500 millimeter prime lens, and I'm taking shots of this beautiful bull moose in the snow, and I'm looking at my images and they're soft. And it took me a while to figure it out. I thought there was something wrong with the lens. Maybe it was my camera, but no, it was because the lens is warm. I'm sitting in a vehicle where warm air comes up the side. And so, it's really akin to in the summer when you're driving down a hot road and you see that sort of water vapor on the road. It's the same kind of idea. So what you can do is before you go home, you can if you have a garage, put your gear out there, and leave. I would say leave it for an hour and a half, and then you throw it in the car, and off you go. You can also, if you don't have a garage, you can also leave it in your car. But if you look at the last sentence there, leave the heater off in the car, as this helps us well. One of you asked before about going with somebody else, and I don't know, like I'm strange that way, because whenever I get close to where I'm going to go, I roll down the windows and I cool the car down as much as I can. And it's when you go with somebody who's not, I don't want to say dedicated because it doesn't sound right, but when you go with somebody who's not on the same page as you, it is not a popular thing to do. But it is necessary if you want to get sharp photos. Online, I saw a video recently by a fella, I think he's down in the Tetons, but what he said was, if you take the lens hood off before you shoot, that helps as well. I tried that. It didn't work. It worked somewhat, but it didn't work the way I had hoped it would. But you could certainly try that too, and take your lens hood off and see if that makes a difference. Because no doubt the lens hood will, it'll trap some warm air in there for sure. Okay, so you've been out in the cold all day, and now you come home, and it's probably nice and warm in your home. So when you bring the cold gear into a warm environment, particularly one that is humid, what happens is you can get condensation. And you likely know this already, but moisture and camera lenses, usually they're not good friends, right? I mean, a lot of lenses are weather sealed for sure. So it's not something I would fret over a lot. However, sometimes what happens is, you get condensation on the inside of a front element. And that is not good, because if you leave it in the dark and whatnot, that's how you can get fungus growing inside your lenses. And obviously you don't want that. So what you do is you need to let your gear acclimatize again. And an easy way to do it is grab a dry bag from your local outdoor store, and just put your gear in there, like your camera and your lens. Throw that in there, and then you can just leave it in the house for a period of time, and eventually you just bring it back out. But the idea is to raise the temperature of your camera and your lens back to the ambient temperature in your house. Yeah, we talked about this before, and just this isn't necessarily just for winter wildlife photography, but your vehicle really makes for a great blind. I was down in Washington State a number of years ago photographing burrowing owls, and whenever, and if you've been to Africa, you'll know this too, right? I mean, you sit in these open safari vehicles and you'll have a lion walking right by the tire of these vehicles, and they don't really even give you a second look. So your vehicle makes for a great blind. When I was down in Washington, I really experienced this firsthand because I'm photographing these burrowing owls from my truck, and then somebody pulled up behind me and got out. And so you had these burrowing owls that were playing around, goofing around as they're, as they tend to do. But as soon as that person got out of the car, they went down in the burrow. And at that point, I just started the car and I left. So most of the time, you just stay in the vehicle, shoot from the vehicle, use the bean bag. Now, if you're out in cold environment, winter environment, even if you turn the car off, you're still going to have warm air that comes up, of course, from the exhaust and from the engine. And so you get that heat shimmer thing again. There are a couple of things you can do to get around that. So as I mentioned before, you drive with the windows open to keep your car cold. But the other thing you can do is use the bean bag, and then you push your camera gear out as far as it can get. And it's to get away from that warm air rising up from underneath the vehicle. So here's a picture of my truck down in Yellowstone. And, this was in April, by the way. So in Yellowstone, you never know. It's like the movie Forrest Gump, and life's like a box of chocolate. You never know what you're going to get. Welcome to Yellowstone. That is much the same. I mean, I think it was 2 days before this, it was almost shorts weather, and and then all of a sudden the storm rolls in. But you can see on the truck, there's icicles in the wheel wells and under the front of it, and obviously the truck is warm, so hence the icicle formation. Yeah. So this is something I find quite challenging. I love wildlife photography when it's snowing. And the same if you switch over to video and you do video in slow motion, it really is a magical time to do this. But it is also very, very difficult for your autofocus system to acquire the focus where you want it to. And I don't know of any surefire way to get around that, but there are a few things I do that seems to work okay for the most part. But it can get really, really frustrating because you may have a magical moment happening and your camera has decided to focus on a snowflake that's either behind what you're shooting or well in front of. But anyhow, here's what I usually try. Manual focus. This is okay as long as your subject is not moving much and without going into too much detail. And you probably know this anyway, but the closer you are to something, the shallower the depth of field tends to be. And with these long lenses, a 600 millimeter lens, I would say at a distance, and I'm making this number up, but just to give you the idea, but at a distance of 10 meters shot wide open at f4, you're probably only getting, I don't know, I'm going to say 3 inches, maybe 2 inches of depth of field. And, for not only wildlife photography, but certainly in wildlife photography, if I don't have an eye that is sharp, I will most often delete the image. So that's why it's crucial to get that critical focus. And so sometimes I try manual focus. Sometimes it works, it doesn't. You can also try one-shot mode in Canon land, or I think with Nikon, it's AFS and single shot with Sony. And usually what I do there is I look for a high contrast area. But again, well, you can take these bison, for example. It is tough to focus on an eye when the eyes are brown, but everything else around it is brown. So that can also be a very, very challenging thing. If you have something like an owl, let's say a great gray owl, for example, that might be a bit easier because they're sort of dark and light. So you can typically find a good contrast area close to the eye that you can focus on. So mentioned previously, look for something that's high contrast on your subject. Spot focus, I can't say I really use this, but I think in at least in theory, you might have a chance, perhaps if it isn't snowing really, really heavily. So spot focus is it is what it says, I guess. But you just focusing on a very, very small area on your subject. But in this, I don't know how well you can see the background of this shot with the bison. But there's no way you're going to pick out an eyeball at that particular distance. But if you're closer, that might be a way to do it. And then the last one is take a lot of images. I remember 4 year ago, I'm photographing grizzly bears here in British Columbia, and it was in September, but it's up high in the mountains. So sure enough, I think it was on the last day, it started to snow, and it really, really started to snow. It's always very, very rewarding, when you get something that is unique, and to get grizzly bears in falling snow for me, that was incredibly rewarding. But you do end up with a lot of blurry shots, quite frankly, and so I don't know how many shots I took, but I took a lot. And out of sequence of 10, I need one that's sharp, maybe two that's sharp. But just remember, take more shots than you normally would. You can also, I didn't put it on here, but the other thing you can do is you can play around with your focus ring, and then roughly where you got it, shoot, and then rotate and shoot, and then rotate and shoot, so that you're covering a deeper depth of field, if you will, in the hope that you're going to get one that's sharp where you need it to be.
Henrik, can I sneak in a quick question that Carolyn has?
Of course.
She's just curious, would back button focus make a difference?
Yeah, good question. I don't know that it would, because the idea is to separate your focus from the shutter button. But I would think that it's still going to use, I'm going to think about this for a bit, but I would think it's still going to use the same mechanism to try to attain focus, right? So if you're an AI servo, it's still going to look for something to rest the focus on. But maybe we'll come back to that one. I'm going to give that one a bit more thought. It's a good question. I don't know that I've really thought about it a lot, but it's definitely a good question to ask. Any other ones, or I'm okay to keep going?
Nope, you're good. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so now we're going to get to this. Don't fret. And that's manual exposure. So you may think I'm crazy. It sounds, it's when I say this to people, they always say, well, oh my goodness, why you don't trust your camera? And it's like, well, yeah, I trust it for certain things, but there are other things I don't trust it for. But with as with just about anything else, there are exceptions to this. Okay, so what I'm about to say does not apply if you are the type of photographer who uses spot metering. But with wildlife, that's moving, good luck. So if you're photographing, I don't know, bald eagles in flight, good luck keeping that spot metering point on the bald eagle as it flies through the scene. So in Canon land, and by the way, I'm brand agnostic, I don't really care, whatever gets the job done. But in Canon land, it's called, I think it's evaluative metering, I believe. But what happens is your camera, if you leave it to its own devices, will try to average out the light that you have in a particular scene. And it does this to roughly what's called 18% gray. So for winter wildlife photography, you say, okay, well, snow is white, but your camera thinks it should be gray. the opposite's also true on the dark side of things. So if you're shooting something that's really, really dark, your camera says, well, it actually should be gray. So this is really, really counterintuitive. I think 9 times out of 10 when I ask somebody, do you in a really snowy, bright environment, do you underexpose or overexpose? So I'll hold my breath just for a second as you think about that. But the answer is you overexpose. And that really, I think for most people sounds counterintuitive. And the reason why you do it is because your camera, when it sees something really bright, it's going to say, well, I want to take it to gray. So for you to bring it back to white, you're going to have to add light. I hope that makes sense. So here's just an example of that, you have to also consider how much does your subject fill up your frame? Because if your subject fills up a lot of the frame, well, then you may be okay, depending on, the amount of light that falls on your subject or the color of the subject. But if it doesn't, as in this example, you cannot trust your camera to do the right metering for you. So most people will say, well, if you're in a snow environment, you add roughly 2 stops of light, and off you go. But I think there's a much, much better way. And I actually learned this the hard way. And speaking of bald eagles, that was when I learned it, because we have a spot that's, I don't know, it's about an hour north of here. And in December, we get a lot of bald eagles. And there's one spot where you shoot off a dike, and so the bald eagles sit on this riverbank, and on the riverbank, if you leave it to your camera, there's a certain amount of light, but then when they take flight, then they're all of a sudden up against these dark trees. And then if they go up against a bright sky, then the scene is really, really bright. And so you're going to have to move your exposure from, I don't know, you're probably almost 3 stops under, 2.5 stops under, to 2 stops over, while you're trying to track this bald eagle in flight. So anyway, it took me a while to figure it out, but here's what I do. So I set the camera to manual, and I mean manual everything. Well, not manual focus, but manual ISO, manual aperture, and manual shutter speed, right? So those are three things you want to decide. And then let's say in the bald eagle example, I say, okay, I'm going to expose for the bald eagle. Bald eagles can be tough because they have a white head and a dark subject. So you have quite a bit of range. Maybe we should use a great gray owl. Well, that's too close to gray anyway. Anyhow, what you do is you meter for your subject. I'm going to pause for a second, but you meter for your subject, and that's it. So what happens now is you can go and you shoot. But because you've set the exposure for the subject, the background doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. So in the eagle example, it didn't matter whether it was, on the riverbank. It didn't matter if it had the dark forest as a background, and it didn't matter if it was up against the sky, because I had set the exposure to meter only for the eagle. And so now, rather than worry about having to spin my wheel on my camera, I can just focus on tracking this eagle. And if you tried it, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't tried it, you may think I'm crazy, but I'm telling you, it works. So here's the caveat. You must pay attention to the light. So if you're in a scenario where it's partly cloudy, where the sun is in and out of the clouds, this is probably not the day to do it, because it's going to be really, really bright, and then it's going to be dark. Or if you have your subject that's moving from a certain light intensity into a different light intensity, it's also going to change. So let's say that, it's a bear that's in a sunny spot, and all of a sudden it goes into the shade. That's going to also change things. But if that is not the case, so if it's a cloudy day and, you can almost shoot 360 degrees, for me anyway, this is the way to do it. And what I would suggest you do is try it in your backyard. If you have a dog, if you have kids, grandkids, or whatever, and as they're, running around, try put your camera in full manual mode. Trust your histogram. If you're not super familiar with it, I suggest you just read up on it, but basically a histogram tells you the distribution of light. And you can check a histogram to see if you're clipping either the lights or the dark. So you don't want to do that. You want to be in between. But this is, if I'm going to share one tip with you tonight that has helped me more than anything else, this is it. This is it. So here's a couple of shots just to illustrate what I'm talking about. This is a snowy owl that, I'll just add one little other tip. If you're photographing birds, by the way, and you want to get the flight shots, and if it's at all possible, be where they usually take off into the wind, right, to increase their lift or to get lift quicker. So if you want to photograph them head on, that's where you want to be. You want to have the wind to your back. And incidentally, this shot was captured, I don't know, maybe about 300 meters apart from each other. Not on the same day, mind you. But this is a shot I don't think I would have gotten if it was not in manual mode, because it's bald eagle flying low to the ground. And then he was ticked off at his other eagle that was sitting in his spot or her spot. It's really hard to tell with bald eagles. The females are bigger than the males. But anyway, he was ticked off at his other eagle that was sitting in, let's say, his spot. And so he was telling that other eagle off, but he came from low to the ground, which would have been one exposure, and then he came up into the air, which of course would have been another exposure. But fortunately, I was in manual mode. Okay, last little section is on how do you find wildlife, and this isn't all seasons. This isn't specific to winter. And the first one is no animal tracks. And I'll throw a quick question out there. Does anybody know what tracks these are? What animal made these tracks? And Linda, if you could just check the comments if anybody has any idea. So anyway, I can keep going, but if anybody does answer that, please let me know. So, and it's not, it's not that you're always going to find the animals just because you know what the tracks are, but I really like to look for one, I find them fascinating, but for another, I really like to look for tracks because at least it tells me what's around. And there are ways you can tell fresh tracks from old tracks. I'm not going to get into that too much, but basically you look at the edge of the track to see how deteriorated it is. But anyhow, so the moral of the story is learn to identify tracks. Did anybody chime in?
Yeah, we've got a couple of guesses. So
good.
We have fox, wolverine.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got somebody that is fox or wolf. I love Susan's here is like, I have no idea on tracks, and I don't either. So we've got, I think wolf is kind of the number one thing in here. Wolf or fox? So
the right answer is it is wolf.
Okay.
It is a wolf. It is a wolf track. This was, this is kind of, I'll tell you a real quick story again, but this encounter was actually really, well, let's just call it interesting, but this is a set of tracks I found last winter. And it was crossing on a riverbank, and then it was going up across the road I'd just driven in on. And so I hiked in after the tracks, and pretty soon I couldn't really follow them anymore. So I went back out in my car. I drove back down the road I came from, and I made a 90-degree right turn because I wanted to see if I could go around the other side and hopefully not catch them, but see them coming out of the forest. But anyhow, I drove down that road and I counted 3 tracks, and then I drove down, I don't know, maybe another 500 meters. I don't know, 600 yards, not that it matters. And then I came back, and when I came driving back, there were no longer 3 tracks, there were 6. So 3 other wolves had passed in the short amount of time that I'd driven down the road, turn around and come back. But it just speaks to how elusive they can be. I mean, I love it. I hated it because I didn't see them, but at the same time, I absolutely love it. You're on their turf, and I mean, there's certain animals that will put up with humans, and then there's others that no, just not going to happen. So the other way to find wildlife is find natural food sources. And in places like Yellowstone, I would say that's a particularly pertinent tip because, you can drive the roads down there fairly easily. And when I was down there in April, on the first day we're driving, I think it was up by, I think it's called Blacktail Ponds. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But driving down the road, and on the far side of this pond, there was a grizzly bear. And it's a bit of a gruesome story, but the grizzly bear was pulling a bison out of the pond. The bison had fallen in, somebody told me, in November. And then I guess, in April, it got warm enough, and the grizzly bears have an incredible sense of smell. And so this grizzly bear wandered over there and he pulled the bison out. But now there's a food source. And over the next, 3-4 days, the grizzly bear came back numerous times, but so did coyotes, so did, in the end, wolves, and so did bald eagles. So you get, you sort of get a few different species at the table, but it's one thing you can do is, when you find a food source, you can often get some really, really good shots there. We did the same thing actually with the coastal wolves here in British Columbia. There was a dead whale that had washed up, and boy, did that not smell good. But nonetheless, if you're a bear, in this case, a black bear, you smell this thing from miles and miles and miles and miles away. So anyway, tip number 2 is find natural food sources. Third one is ask around, and it can be online forums, it can be other photographers. One of my favorite stories is, surprise, from Yellowstone as well, and it was actually when I was checking into the at the Motel 8 or whatever it's called, Super 8, I think, in Gardner. And as I'm checking in, I'm casually speaking with another lady who was just checking in. And, I said, so have you seen anything interesting in the park? He goes, oh, yeah, there's a wolf pack just inside the gate. I said, what? She says, did you not see the wolf pack just inside the gate? And I mean, I just, driven there. And so I checked in record time and went back out the door, and I drove in, through the gate there. And this is the road that goes between Gardner up to Mammoth Hot Springs. And sure enough, a couple of kilometers in, there's an elk that a pack of wolves had taken down. And, over the next 2-3 days, we're photographing wolves at a fairly close distance, not too close, but certainly close enough for getting great photographs. The other one is pay attention to nature's indicators. And I remember one time driving down, I think I'm going to save this story till the end, but suffice it to say, you look for things that seem strange. So for example, it can be, you see ravens hanging out with bald eagles in a tree. That normally doesn't happen. It's not like they're buddies or anything like that. So that tells you something is probably going on. You can look for other things, but it's, when you sit down and you pay attention, I mean, I guess you don't have to sit down, but when you just sit down and look around, often you're going to pick up on things that you wouldn't otherwise. So I would say just really, really pay attention to nature. Research is another big one. I remember the first time I photographed osprey. I mean, a lot of you are in the Texas area, so you probably have them all year round down there. We don't up here. We get them in April, and then September they leave and they go south. And I mean, I think they're just absolutely incredible. But if you didn't know that there are no osprey here in February, well, then obviously you're never going to find them. And research is really, really important because it's going to save you time, it's going to save you money, and it's going to save you from disappointment. Bald eagles, we have them all year here, but come November and December, we get enormous congregation of them this other place I mentioned about an hour north of here, they usually have in this town, they usually have, I would say, between 800 to 1,000 bald eagles. And in a record year, they had over 3,000 of them. But if you go up there in February, you're going to be sorely, or you're going to be, you're going to be disappointed. So research is key. I put national parks on here because national parks, I think, are a great place to go. Wildlife often don't have the same, I'm trying to be diplomatic as I say this, but wildlife in national parks usually don't have the same pressures that wildlife does outside the park. So I mentioned Yellowstone, it can be Denali, Katmai, here in Canada, we have Banff, Jasper, we have a place called Wells Grave, Anyway, the moral of the story is national parks is a great place to go because you'll often find that wildlife is much more accommodating to human presence. Eyes and ears, and eyes are obvious. Ears maybe less so, but I can't tell you the number of times I've found things or discovered things with my ears. Give you an example would be pygmy owls. Pygmy owls are these tiny, cute little owls. They're about the size of a softball. And often when you see them, you might think it's a robin or a similarly sized bird, but they are ferocious little owls. And they're really, really hard to spot. Now, I happen to know they make this, well, I'm not going to make the sound because it will sound ridiculous, but it's like this beeping sound, I guess. And if you know that, and you're sitting out there just listening and you hear this beeping, well, then, there's a pygmy owl around. In the same weather, it's, a wolf howling would be nice, but with many, many other animals, they will make some type of sound. And that's where your ears come in. You could use your nose too, I suppose, if you want to hopefully find a dead whale or something decomposing. But of all the senses, I would say my ears have been probably even more productive than my eyes in many instances. So sometimes just turn off the car or stop hiking or walking and just sit and then wait and then see what you hear. See what you hear. Hear what you hear.
She's here.
Okay, hiding. People ask me, do you use blinds? The answer is yes, sometimes, but you'd be surprised how effective it can be not to hide. And this sounds probably a little bit crazy, but I've had lots of instances where I'm actually doing the opposite. I'm making myself obvious. Now, I'm not doing anything that's loud or, I'm not moving quickly either. That would be a mistake. But what seems to work is if you pretend you're not interested, and it's hard to do because inside, you really want to get that photograph, and especially if it's a species that has been on your bucket list, and you see this animal and you go, oh, I got to get the shot. But you really have to just calm down. Animals live in nature 100% of the time. We don't. So chances are they're going to know you're there before you do. I mean, grizzly bears smell better than a bloodhound. Wolves can see you far, far away. Bald eagle's another bird that can see you far, far, far away. So sneaking up on wildlife, I'm not saying it's impossible, but in a lot of instances, it's just not going to happen. And there's been lots of times when I'm out there and I just make myself known. Yes, I have been known to talk to animals, which sounds crazy, but it's not because I expect them to understand what it is I'm saying, obviously, but it's so that they know where I am. They can, see me there, they can hear me there. And then I sort of zigzag, but slowly move my way closer. And you really have to pay attention to what the animal does. Some animals are going to tell you that it stresses them, in which case just forget about it, like just walk away. But in other instances, they're actually okay with your presence. I've had had a great gray owl, for example, that once flew from across the field, and it sat on this post in front of me, and in fact it was so close I couldn't focus on it. It was inside the minimum focusing distance on my on my big lens, which I think is 6 meters or some 18 feet or something like that. And at first I thought, gee, somebody must have fed this thing mice, which I don't bait any of the wildlife I photograph, but that's what I thought, because it came straight to me. But it sat there for, I don't know, 2-3 seconds, and then it turned around and faced into the field and wasn't even looking at me. So anyhow, so then eventually it flew back on the other side. I walked down this road and I sat down at another fence post, and it did it again. So what was happening was the owl was zigzagging on this field hunting for mice. But I mean, I was out in the wide open. Now, great grays at times a lot of times are very accommodating to humans. That's obviously not always the case. So so hiding sometimes works, but often it doesn't. If you're not in a hide or you're not hidden, just approach very slowly. Don't do anything fast. Don't make a lot of sudden moves or a lot of noise. So, yeah. So then, just the last thing, as I said before, respect wildlife. I find that I have to say, vast majority of photographers I come across, they do. Not everybody does, though, and I have been guilty of inadvertently, I think, actually interfering with a northern hawk owl hunting. And I realized I was standing in a field, and I'm looking around, and there were, I don't know how many other photographers, too many, but I realized we were all standing in the field where this owl was hunting, and so immediately I packed up. I grabbed my tripod and I just walked away. There's no photograph that's worth hindering an animal or a bird. So that's all. Please remember just to be respectful. As I said, we as wildlife photographers, I think you have to be an advocate for wildlife, because otherwise, why the heck are you doing it? That's got to be number one. So I want to finish, just tell you about this little story. Sorry about the graphic bit on the right, but this is a story that combines a lot of these things. It is also down in Yellowstone. It was probably one of my favorite wildlife encounters that I've ever had, and it goes like this. So this is a number of years ago. If you know Yellowstone, this is out towards the Lamar Valley, and what had happened. I'm going to go between the slides, but what had happened was I was driving down the road, and sure enough, there were ravens and bald eagles sitting in a tree together, and I thought that doesn't make any sense. They don't, they're not buddies or anything like that. And so I pulled over, and this was at Tower Junction, and so I walked back across this bridge, and and then kind of up into the sage, and I couldn't really find anything at first, and then lo and behold, there was an elk kill. And for the next 2 days, I would photograph. There's a few coyotes that came in, but nothing else, at least not during the day. I met up with a fellow I know from Seattle, and then on the last day, it was getting dark, and we decided, well, we're going to go back to Gardner where we were staying, but we had separate vehicles. And so we start driving off, and we get up to, sorry, I'm just trying to advance this slide again. We get up to the turnoff, and he goes, and I'm just kind of taking my time because it was, the last night there, and nobody else in the park. I think it was in November, so it was really, really quiet. And I just happened to look over my right shoulder, and I see this little dot on the horizon, and I thought, oh, it doesn't really look like it belongs there. And so sure enough, it was a wolf. So I decided I was going to drive back to, where the elk kill was. And there's sort of like a little gully drainage where you could see the elk there for, I don't know, like a blink of an eye, maybe, as you're driving. And so I drove by it, and there was nothing there. So I crossed over the bridge and turned around, and I drove back again, and I gave another quick glance, and I thought, oh, there's a coyote. Well, but wait a minute, it was this wolf. And so I pulled over and I thought, well, maybe I can just sneak up behind this knoll. And this comes back to the hiding part. I thought maybe I can just sneak up over this little knoll and then inch my camera over top of this rock and I can get some shots. I mean, the wolf surely won't even know I'm here. And so I get out, I get my camera gear out again, and I pull over to the side of the road, and so I sneak up this knoll and slowly get my camera up there, and I'm pointing at the wolf, and it's sitting there looking at me. So it knew I was there the whole time, and so I thought, okay, well, I'm going to make myself more obvious, and so for the next, I think it was maybe about 10 minutes, I got some shots. I mean, this is a high ISO shot, but then eventually it got too dark. And I thought, well, I just want to enjoy the moment. And so I stood up. And as I stand up, a coyote comes walking out from the bush on my left, walks in front of me, and comes and it stands 3 feet to my right. 3 feet. So now it's me, a coyote, and a wolf in Yellowstone, November night, nobody else around. And I thought, well, geez, is there something wrong with this coyote? So I kind of took like a little baby step towards it. And so it took another baby step further away to maintain that 3 foot distance. And eventually, and by the way, I knew the wolf was completely comfortable with me there because at one point it lay down with its back to me, facing the other way. And, and it would be, I don't know, a minute to 2 minutes. It wouldn't even look in my direction. So there's no stress on behalf of the wolf, and then it would feed. Anyhow, so here I am standing next to this coyote. Eventually the wolf, and I think what it was one of the younger wolves in the pack. So, there's a pecking order. And again, you most likely know this, but in a wolf pack, there's a pecking order insofar as who eats first and who eats last. So I think this was one of the younger wolves that ate last. And anyway, the wolf walks off, and the coyote walks over and starts to get the scraps off this elk kill. And I said, well, maybe I need to get my butt out of there and go back to town and go back, sit in my car. And as I'm taking my gloves off, a fox walks right next to my car. And I sit there and I just shake my head. As it turns out, the only conclusion I could come to is that I was providing protection somehow for this coyote, because of course wolves will at times kill coyotes. But that is but one story of why I love wildlife photography, and particularly in the winter, is because if you're lucky, really, really lucky, you get to have moments like that. So with that, I will take your questions if you have any.
I have one question. On the last photo, would you go back to it? Because for whatever reason, it flipped to the bunny. But I want people a chance to look at this. No, go back to the wolf picture.
Yep.
There you go. Yeah. I just wanted people to get another chance to look at that photo, because it wasn't on the screen while you were telling most of the story. Okay, thank you. You can take that down. I have one question in the chat, and it has to do with Churchill. Susan has been wanting to go there. So her question is, how did you get to Churchill? Did you drive it? She's looking for options, and she looked into going by train, but she doesn't really know what is the best way. So
yep.
If you have any suggestions, that would be great.
Yeah, so you can't drive to Churchill. There are no roads that go up there. But sorry, was it Susan that asked the question?
Yes, Susan.
Mm-hmm. So like Susan said, you can take the train. So you can take it from Winnipeg, which is really a really, really long train ride, or you can take it from a town called Thompson. You can also fly from Winnipeg. The ideal time to go, I would say, is it depends on the freeze up, right? Because when the freeze up happens, they're gone like that. But I would say mid-October to I would say first week into November, and I would go closer to November than I would the middle of October. The way things have been going up there, freeze up is happening later and later and later. So I would definitely go in November, and then I haven't taken the train. Another buddy of mine took the train this year, and I think he said it's. Don't quote me on this, but I think it's something like 17 hours. It's long. Yeah, it's long because once they get up into the tundra, they can't go too fast. But it takes a long time on the train. But I mean, hey, you know what? You can make an experience out of it, right? Like I don't say it as a bad thing. It kind of depends on what your sense of adventure is and what you're looking for. Or you can fly from Winnipeg. But if you're going to fly from Winnipeg, it's not cheap, because I think there's only one airline there's not many airlines that fly up there. You can also I understand you can do a 1-day trip from either Edmonton or Calgary, but you know what, if you have the inclination to do it the other way. So, yeah.
Okay. One other question, and I don't know that I've ever seen whales in your Instagram feed, but Susan's curious. Susan, just go. She wants to know, do the beluga whales still show up in Churchill?
Yep, they do. I think it's usually in June. I haven't photographed them there, but I believe in June they do. And there are tours that will take you out to see them. Okay,
this next question really is coming from somebody that is a non-wildlife photographer. In fact, she kind of makes fun of me because I like birds. For her to ask this question, she's been paying attention. So Valerie's question is, Henrik, do you sell your images, share with magazines, et cetera, so on? I'm going to share the chat with you because there's some nice comments in here, and Valerie's one of them. So you've kept your attention. The question is, do you sell your images and do you share the magazines? And
this is maybe not going to sound great, but I don't spend very much time on marketing, which maybe I should. The short answer to the question is I sell them, but on a one-off basis. I have thought about setting up a print shop. I need to investigate it a bit more. The reason why I haven't done it yet is because I need it to be set up in such a way that it's going to sound awful, but it can't take up a lot of time, because I love being outdoors. I love being amongst animals. I'm lucky to have a friend in Alberta, actually, who has a gallery with a print service. So I often use him. He ships anywhere in the world, but I like him because he does archival prints and he coats them so you don't have fading of color and all this other good stuff. But I do it on a one-off basis. It's not something that I've set out to do as part of business, if you will. Insofar as the other part, I somehow ended up doing a fair bit with Canadian Geographic, either through their calendars. I mean, it's kind of a funny story. I had a photo they asked for their 2023 wildlife calendar. I don't know, I think it's almost a year ago, and I kind of forgot about it. And then all of a sudden I get, they say, well, we'll send you one. And usually with somebody like Canadian Geographic, I donate the images. I don't charge them for it just because I really believe in what they do. Anyway, so they sent me this calendar, and well, I looked at the photo on the cover, and because I kind of forgotten about it, I thought, geez, I have a photo just like that. Well, of course, guess what? It was my photo. What an idiot, right? But I'd forgotten about the whole thing. And anyhow, so I provide images to organizations like that. I've done some. We have a tourist organization here. There's actually a funny story with this, but are we okay for time? By the way, I have another kind of funny story. Can I squeeze it in? Okay. Anyway, so this was an image that it was Tourism BC that purchased it, so it's for commercial use. So I charged them for it. Anyhow, so it's this grizzly bear with a salmon hanging out of its mouth, right? And it was a foggy morning. We're like low on the river, so it's like eye level. Well, it was almost below eye level shot. So it's a very moody shot, and so they bought it because they were going to use it in this advertising campaign. And then the following year, I'm up at this. Every year I go to this. I guess you can call it a lodge, but it's this place for grizzly bears where we stay in these safari tents up on this big platform, and it's quite remote. Anyway, so I'm sitting there at their table. There's a long table where everybody eats together, and I'm just catching up on emails, and I was actually on a photo forum, and I see this ad, and I look at this ad, and it was an ad for Tourism BC had put out, but it was my own image. So it was a surreal experience. But anyhow, coming back to the question, I sell a few images for commercial use. I will sell images for personal use, but it's on a one-off basis.
Okay. Well, Henrik, I'm going to get you to stop sharing your screen. I should have done that just a few minutes ago. So
Sorry. Yep.
No.
Oh, there's everybody.
There's everybody. So,
there's
me. I'm very pink today in my Costa Rican cloud cover tan, I guess. I don't know. I look kind of funny on screen tonight. Henrik, I want to meet you and I want to shoot with you, and I'm just going to throw it out there. So you can't say no to me on screen, but don't block I would
never. Never.
I so appreciate you coming. Being in Texas, we don't have a lot of snow. Okay, that being said, we were buried in it a year ago, but I have experienced Yellowstone. I've stayed in the hotel. I knew exactly where you were, and I didn't get that kind of opportunity, but man, did I have fun. And I think what's key that being from South Texas, I live in shorts and flip-flops in December, but to go to Yellowstone in the winter and being in the right clothing and the boots, oh my goodness. I think you're right. Once you get wet, you're done, and it's not fun.
It's not fun,
Yeah. And so the images I love that you did this presentation where you showed images, just kind of supplement what you're talking about. So we had some beautiful pictures to look at, and I'm just going to ask you to come back sometime. I won't bug you for a while, but I would love for you to come back and talk about your animals and maybe some of the stories behind the shots, because this is a very selfish thing to ask, but I just so enjoy. I've been watching you on YouTube, and before we started, I kind of hit him up for some tips on videoing, and I am really enjoying the work you're putting out there. I would just like to ask for you to put out a little bit more because I'm caught up on your videos. So thank you so much for coming. Everyone, if you'd like to connect with Henrik, you can through his website and Instagram. It's under the same name, Photography by Henrik. That's a .com if you're looking for his website. He's also on YouTube under his name, Henrik Nilsson. So next week, we are off to celebrate Thanksgiving in America. It's funny because I'm in Costa Rica, and several people said, oh, I went to the United States for Thanksgiving one time, and they celebrated here. So that kind of caught me off guard, but we're going to be off, but we'll be back on November 30th with Harrison Funk. And if you were here for his first presentation, he's funny. He's got some great, interesting stories. He was Michael Jackson's personal photographer at one point, through right before his death. So he will be back to share some of his portrait photography of some of the most recognizable names and faces in entertainment. Until next time, go out and create something beautiful. And I hope that we see you again soon.